Welcome, I'm Stephen Winnick of the American Folklife Center at the Library of Congress, and I'm here on the stage of the Coolidge Auditorium, where for many years we have presented the Homegrown Concert Series featuring the best in traditional music and dance from around the world. And when we can, we like to do interviews with the artists that we present in the Homegrown Concert Series. So it's my pleasure to introduce to you today the Reverend Robert Jones, Sr., who, as we speak, is going to give a concert in the Coolidge Auditorium later this evening. So if you're seeing this video and you haven't seen the concert, you should know that there's also a concert video with Reverend Robert Jones, Sr. on the Library of Congress website and YouTube channel. Now, the Reverend Robert B. Jones, Sr. is an inspirational musician and storyteller celebrating the history of African-American music and all forms of American roots music, in fact. He makes his home in Detroit, Michigan, and performs throughout the United States and Canada, and he's an award-winning multi-instrumentalist. We'll talk about the many instruments he plays. And he has performed educational and entertaining programs in all kinds of folk music venues. As an ordained minister and Baptist pastor, he has an unwavering faith in the cultural importance of sacred and traditional American roots music. So at the heart of his message is the belief that cultural diversity should be celebrated, and that's one of the reasons why we are featuring the Reverend Jones in Black History Month, the month of February 2024. So welcome to the Coolidge Auditorium. Welcome to the Library of Congress.
Thank you, Stephen. This is something I've been looking forward to for a good little amount of time.
Yeah, we have too. Ever since we saw you at Folk Alliance a couple of years ago and chatted with you then about all the wonderful things you do and the music that you play. So you do play a range of traditional American roots music. Why don't you tell us a little bit about how you like to describe the music that you do?
Well, there was a time when the idea was to separate different kinds of music, right? Folks talked about playing Piedmont blues versus Delta blues, right. Country western versus bluegrass versus honky-tonk, gospel versus spirituals. And so we had all of these different kinds of music separated and categorized, which is great for record stores, right. If there are still record stores. But the idea is that, you know, all of this music comes out of the common shared experience of these folks working and singing and praising next to each other. And so now we've got all of these great categories, and this music, which is essentially more alike than different, sort of gets shunted as being something old-fashioned, and we start to appreciate the commonalities between those different styles of music. And so now we have the umbrella of roots music, right? It's you have artists who collaborate with each other. You have someone like Doc Watson, who listened to Mississippi John Hurt. Yeah. And Mississippi John Hurt listened to Jimmy Rogers. And so you've got this really wonderful mix of American roots music. And that's really the pool that I tend to draw from.
Great, yeah, which of course it always was that way, and yet we separated them out into categories for a while.
Right.
But as you say, all of these great performers in all the different genres were listening to one another for sure. So you are from Detroit originally. How does that origin, how does the great city of Detroit play into your work and your music?
Well, first of all, you know, Detroit is resilient. It's like, it's a place where people have an idea of what Detroit is, but yeah. Detroit really was a beacon to people all over the world. It was the place where Henry Ford paid people $5 a day, which was an unheard of amount at the turn of the century, to come and build cars. It is diverse, and at the same time, it has its own brand of segregation or separation or whatever. And it's a city that people are constantly trying to write off, and we just won't die. We will not yield. And so I think that's part of what I love about this music, because it is also resilient. But if you think about the people who came up to work in the plants in Detroit, a lot of times, like there were people in Kentucky who would work in Detroit 5 days a week. Friday night, they jump on I-75 and go back home and get refreshed, play their bluegrass, do their dances, and then come back. It's like what's that old song about Detroit City?
Yeah.
Last night I went to sleep in Detroit City, dreaming about the cotton fields back home. That was an experience that all of the residents, the poorer residents of Detroit had. At the same time, the auto industry being what it was, you also had people who built great institutions and millionaires who kind of erected these wonderful things like the Detroit Institute of Arts, and there's a great mural done by Diego Rivera in the Institute of Arts, and you see Henry Ford up on the top level,
Right.
and all of the people working on the line. And so all of that stuff, growing up in Detroit is a great place. I've been a lot of places, but I can't really think of living anywhere else. Yeah.
So in your presentations, there's sort of equal parts of entertainment and education. You really are an educator in many ways. Could you talk about that aspect of what you like to do?
Yeah, a couple of people really influenced what I tend to do on the stage. One was Willie Dixon, who was a great bass player, arranger, songwriter with Chess Records in Chicago. And just when I was sort of beginning my performing career, he came through Detroit and he said, there's something called blues in schools. And he was encouraging musicians who liked children and weren't afraid of playing in schools to go into schools and talk about blues music. And the way that Mr. Dixon put it, it was like not only music, but it was history, it was cultural appreciation. We would go in and actually work with kids in a classroom and say, I am the blues, I am to be protected, I'm to be, admired. And it was kind of like a self-esteem thing. So that idea of utilizing blues, I would just discovered I would much rather play for kids than drunks. So
Yeah.
that part was cool. And then I got to teach at a camp in New Hampshire and got to hang out with Mike Seeger for a week. And there was something about Mike Seeger that was like, this guy is a walking encyclopedia of really obscure music. And he was open with it. And I can't tell you the number of people I've run into who said, I got to spend time with Mike Seeger and it changed my musical life. Well, same thing with me. And I decided that I would rather be the black Mike Seeger than the short Taj Mahal.
Good plan. Yeah, we love Mike here, and in fact, we have some major collections of Mike's that he donated to us before he passed away.
Yeah.
So yeah, he's been an important part of our legacy as well. So thank you so much for mentioning him, and Willie Dixon. My gosh, that's a great figure to have taken from as well.
Yeah,
So,
he was a cool guy.
yeah. So what about other musical influences on you? What who shines brightly in your pantheon?
Well, not about 3 miles from where I live is Son House is buried. And I never, quote, met him, but I visited his nursing home once. And there he was, kind of like, shadow of his former self. But it was because of the Library of Congress that, I heard his Jinx blues, his Death Letter blues, Preaching blues, and all of that stuff was really formative for me as a musician. So I really admire Son House. Sonny Terry and Brownie McGee were two guys. My grandmother brought home this record when I was 10, 11 years old. And, I'm raised in Motown, right? So, of course, I love the Temptations and the Four Tops and all those guys. But I was a weird kid, man. Here I am listening to Sonny and Brownie and buying a harmonica, playing along with Sonny, and eventually went to a pawn shop, got a guitar, playing along with Brownie. So those guys were amazing and still are amazing to me. Reverend Gary Davis, who showed the possibilities of a guitar in the coolest ways. But then Doc Watson, he was on his farewell tour that probably lasted 15 years.
Yeah.
And I got to see him at this little club in Detroit called the Soup Kitchen Saloon, and it was magic again. It was like, so I draw info. I love Willie Nelson, the way his timing and all that kind of stuff. So it was like, there's so much great American music where the people who are the creators and innovators of that music, they appreciate it across cultural lines, across racial lines. And eventually the idea came to me in my school presentations, and eventually it's now leaked into my regular adult presentations, to celebrate American diversity and to speak of it in terms of celebration and not tolerance. Tolerance is something you hate it, but you can't change it.
Right.
But celebration is something that you say, wow, we wouldn't be a winning team without this guy who's 7 foot and this little guard who's 6 foot.
Right.
And you start to appreciate the diversity of American music when you start to listen to a broad range of it.
Yeah. Well, one of the ways that you've gotten into that is to play not just guitar, which is the kind of quintessential blues instrument, but a whole bunch of other instruments. So talk a little about some of the instruments you play and your what might be your favorites.
Yeah, I'm basically self-taught, and so going into schools, if you're going to talk about American music, you got to represent American music.
Yeah.
So it was like Mike Seeger who got me turned on to not only the regular steel string 5-string banjo, but he was playing gourd banjos.
Right.
So I got a gourd banjo, and then I did research and figured out that it was a guy named Joel Sweeney who added that 5th string to the banjo. The original African banjo had 3 long strings, 1 short.
Right.
Had to get one of those. It was Mike who turned me on to playing the fiddle. And so I'm not a great fiddler, but there are aspects of African American fiddling that I really like to bring to audiences. I started playing mandolin because of Yank Rachel. And a great sound coming out of Brownsville, Tennessee. And recently, and of course I started off with harmonica with Sonny Terry and folks like that.
Right.
And recently I have become just fascinated with the ukulele because it has this sonic range that kind of reminds me of a guy named Washington Phillips who played something called the dulceola. Right, but it's like I can't find a dulceola, and if I could find it, my wife wouldn't let me buy it. And if I had it, I couldn't play it. So I started doing stuff on ukulele and then found out how ridiculously versatile that thing is. So every time I find an instrument that I go, we should know more about that, I just sort of take what I know. I take the 1-4-5 chord progression, and I find a pentatonic scale, and that's it.
Yeah.
Leadbelly has this recording where he says, "There was a song that I learned from a German fella who was talking about his cow. Now, he loved that cow, but the cow was gone. Now, I don't know where he got that song, but now it's mine." So that's my attitude, man.
Right.
So now it's mine.
That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you could probably, our friend Andy Cohen.
Oh, yeah.
I'm sure you could get a dulceola if you.
Yeah, it's like you can only get so much stuff in the car, right?
Right. Well, that's
the
other
ukulele
thing,
is a lot smaller than a dulceola.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, and that's what we talked about that time at Folk Alliance too, is the need to be selective when you're traveling these days.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So you did bring the gourd banjo this time, I think.
I wanted to, but then I had like 7 people in a 7-passenger minivan.
Right, yeah, sure, yeah.
And something had to go.
Yeah.
So I left the gourd banjo at home.
Oh, well.
But I did bring the 6-string, and I brought the Leadbelly 12-string.
Right. Awesome.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. So, but I mean, the gourd banjo is an important sort of symbol too, in the sense that a lot of people don't know about the origins and history of the banjo. So it's good to put that in your set as well.
Absolutely. There's a book out recently, you know, Well of Souls.
Yeah, yeah.
Which is, you know, chronicling the history of the banjo and how it could be a meditative instrument, but it also could be a subversive instrument, especially in the Caribbean.
Right.
And so, yeah, I love that instrument. I kind of like was looking at it going, but
Yeah.
no way I could
Yeah.
I could fit it in, and
Yeah.
I would have had to leave one of my granddaughters behind. Couldn't do that.
Yeah, but I mean, also the diversity of instruments that you play kind of reflects the musical diversity of African American life, which a lot of people aren't aware of, the African American string bands and all that. Everyone thinks of the guitar, but you know, you had mandolins, you had fiddles, you had all that as well.
Right.
So have you taken inspiration from some of those
Man.
groups?
Yeah, I had the great fortune living in Detroit before he moved to Boston of knowing Howard Armstrong from Martin, Bogan, and Armstrong, right? And Howard was a master fiddler, a great mandolin player, could play guitar. I think he played like 17, 18
Yeah,
instruments.
he played a lot of instruments.
It's ridiculous.
Yeah.
And again, he was like one of those guys who just, you know, he's a great storyteller, calligrapher, artist, visual artist. So he's one of those guys who kind of convinces you that if you can believe you can do it, you do it, right? And yeah, that whole string band sound is amazing. You think about African American music in its earlier days. You got the Mississippi Sheiks.
Yeah.
You know, they sort of set the standard of this music. And the thing that was really cool is that the Sheiks had black and white musical fans. So if they were playing a white dance, you know, they were playing music that those folks could identify with. If they were playing some, you know, gut bucket juke joint, then they were playing blues or whatever. But they were really professional musicians in the strictest sense of the word. So yeah, I mean, that stuff is great.
Yeah. Well, I got to spend a day once with Howard Armstrong back in Philadelphia when I worked at a folk life center there, and just what an amazing musician and personality.
Oh, he was great,
Yeah.
man. He, you know, many times he would say, "Now, you can play too slow, but you can't play too fast." And I'd be dodging that bow, man. You know, John Henry or something. You know, he was great.
Yeah.
And I wish actually that I had gotten into fiddle while I still had access to Howard, but it sort of came to it later.
Yeah.
He was wonderful.
Yeah, great guy. Well, so another person that you've mentioned and that has been a big influence on you is Leadbelly. You brought your 12-string, and you do a whole show based on Leadbelly. So tell us a little about your connection to him and why you chose to make that a feature.
Well, you know, the Lord works in mysterious ways, right? I was, I think, a teenager, or at least a really young guy. And I went to a movie with Clint Eastwood, Outlaw Josie Wales.
Right.
Back in those days, you know, with double feature. I went to see Outlaw Josie Wales. Leadbelly was on was the next movie, and here it was played by Roger Mosley. Right. And it was during the period where it kind of had these black exploitation movies, you know, Dolomite and Superfly and all of that stuff. But Gordon Parks, I think, directed it. And clearly now I see that he didn't have a big budget.
Right.
They made do, man. The guitar that Leadbelly was playing was from the 1960s, but it didn't matter. And I saw this movie, and it was pretty cool, you know? So that name stuck in my brain. And then as I started to get deeper into the music, I saw this guy who looked a little bit like me, build-wise anyway. And my hair was jet black then. Yeah. But there was something about the idea of his resilience. A guy who's in prison, sings his way out of prison, goes back to prison, sings his way out of prison again, you know, does like 4 different prison stints. a guy who I admired, but at the same time, a guy that I think I would not have liked
Right.
in person, right?
I know what you mean, yeah.
Selfish, like kind of a big baby kind of guy.
Yeah.
But again, one of America's great artists. Pete Seeger calls him the greatest folk singer he had ever seen, right? So I started to dig into his life and ran across that book on Leadbelly, Charles Wolfe and
Kip Lornell.
Kip Lornell,
Yeah.
right? And I started to get into this book, and I'm like, dude, kids need to know about Leadbelly. Got some baby powder, put it in my hair.
Yeah.
Got a guitar that was close to the kind of guitar Leadbelly was playing, and started playing this stuff. And then there was something about his, again, God works in mysterious ways, right? I'm looking for a guitar that's close to Leadbelly, the kind of Stella that he used to play. Yeah. And I have a friend who's a guitar repairman and builder. And one day I'm like, man, I can't find a Stella. If I could find a Stella, I probably could afford it. They're all delicate, they're all cheap, and they're falling apart. And I show up at his shop, and he says, so what color would you like the, what are you talking about? He started building one for me. So that was definitely like, okay, it's something you got to do.
A sign, yeah.
And I put together a one-man show, which, sort of take on his persona as much as I can and tell his story from the first person perspective. And I did it at the National Storytelling Festival, and they recorded it. And it's really great. It's like, again, a really complex guy. Mm-hmm. And but definitely, people need to know about him. They forget about him, and then about every 25 years, he reappears in a new set or a new, box set or a new documentary or something like that. So I love bringing him into classrooms and churches and wherever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very cool. Well, you mentioned, performing that at the National Storytelling Festival, and storyteller is another one of your roles sometimes. Tell us a little about the connection between storytelling and music for you.
There have been some really great storytellers who happen to be musicians, right? Probably going way back to the earliest days. I guess you could call Mark Twain one of those kind of guys, right? But and I think about someone like Gamble Rogers, right, who tells a story, and Leadbelly. You get a Leadbelly cut, it could be 4 minutes a story and 2 minutes a song, right? But I was invited to the National Storytelling Festival, I think because my friend Roy Bookbinder couldn't make it one year, and he's a great storyteller, And he says, there's this guy named Robert, he tells stories, he's from Detroit. And they tell me that I was on their radar before then, but I don't know. Anyway, I show up, and I meet this lady. The first voice I hear is this lady named Catherine Tucker Wyndham.
Yeah, we have great recordings of her, yeah.
She was amazing, man. She was telling a story about growing up in Selma, Alabama, and we're laughing, and then we're crying, and then we're laughing again. And I go, that's what I want to be when I grow up, right?
Yeah.
So I have been really welcomed into the family of storytelling. And the thing is, sometimes music can be a little snarky. Yeah. Folks can be, competitive, and, we're fighting over whether or not Beyonce needs album of the year and that kind of stuff. But storytellers, for the most part, are some of the most generous people you've ever met. And if they like you, and if you're one of them, they accept you. So Donald Davis, and Bill Lepp, and Barbara McBride Smith, and Miss Catherine, were all just like, oh, welcome, honey, And before I knew it, it was like I had this different, this other community that I was a part of. And those of us who play instruments and augment our stories with those, Bill Harley, those of us who do it, we kind of bring a different perspective, but we have absolute respect for folks who just stand there and tell a story.
Yeah.
It's cool.
Yeah, it's brave. you know,
It
in
is.
a certain way. Yeah.
You're naked. Man.
Yeah, yeah. So we, at the American Folklife Center, we also have the National Storytelling Festival collection. So that's why we have all those recordings. We have recordings of you in there.
Oh, really?
Yeah, we must.
Well,
I'm sure.
that's the reason
Or
I'm
we
here,
will.
man.
Yeah.
It's like,
So,
yeah, you know, you guys do such a wonderful thing, you know, in terms of, and I tell people this sometimes in performance. When I was a kid in college, I read about a guy named Blind Willie Johnson, and they said he was one of the greatest sanctified singers and one of the most powerful, you know, slide guitar players. And I had not heard him because in those days you didn't have CDs. There was no internet. There were no virtual guitar lessons. So I had to go to a library. I had to go to the Detroit Public Library, the E. Azalea Hackley collection. And this lady named E. Azalea Hackley loved all kinds of music, but especially African-American music. And she had a record by Blind Willie Johnson, Dark Was the Night, Cold Was the Ground. And that librarian, wearing those little white gloves, put it on the turntable, put those little earphones on my ear, and I heard him for the first time. It's like libraries preserve those things that we need until we're old enough to appreciate that we need them, you know? And so that's what I love.
Yeah, and we've got John Lomax's recordings of Blind Willie Johnson as well, which are pretty amazing also. And that brings up another topic, which, you know, you mentioned that he was a great sanctified singer, and there's often a tension in blues folks who kind of get the spirit and or become you know, people of the cloth, and they have to sort of rethink their relationship to the blues. So how did you negotiate that in your life?
I had this crazy grandmother who just liked all kinds of, well, not all kinds of music. I mean, she never played Wagner for me, but she liked a lot of kinds of American music. So it was not unusual to hear Reverend James Cleveland right next to James Brown, right next to Muddy Waters, next to Lightning Hopkins. Just grew up with that eclectic idea. But then, you know, when I got a call to the ministry, of course, most ministers don't play blues. And most ministers, in fact, used to talk about, and I guess some still do, talk about, you know, this world's music and this is God's music. Until I ran into a guy I greatly respected, named Reverend Percy Moore, who said, all music is God's music. The devil has no music. It's like, whoa, right?
Interesting thought, yeah.
It was interesting, right? And then I started to think, you know, who was it that told you that this was good and this was bad, right? It's probably the guy, like Frederick Douglass talks about, writes about. It's probably the guy who is going to church on Sunday and whipping you on Monday. That's the guy who's determining what is good and bad, right? And then you get to the point where you go, you know, the blues is about resilience, just like the spiritual is about resilience. But the blues is about, you know, leaving this familiar place, going somewhere else, and trusting that, you know, the sun's gonna shine in my back door one day. And gospel is like staying where you are and trusting that God's gonna shine, the sun's gonna shine in your back door one day. And so it seemed like, to me, there was no problem as long as you're the same guy, as you're not conflicted. I'm not Son House. I'm not a hard-drinking blues man and a teetotaling preacher. I'm pretty much the same guy all over. And it was like Willie Dixon and all those other people. And there's a guy named Buell Casey from country. He was a preacher. But he played this old music because he saw the value of it in his community. So that's me. That's how I reconciled it. And so far, it's working out okay.
Sounds good. So another aspect of history that you talk about sometimes, and you began when I asked you about Detroit, is labor, and you played for labor halls and all kinds of labor events. Talk about the importance of that in your career as well.
It is, you know, we have a society that sometimes forgets where it comes from. The fact is that when you got to Detroit in the early part of the 20th century, there would be more jobs, or there would be more people than there were jobs.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it's true, if it's a true story, but I'm told that sometimes the plant manager would come out and he would take a quarter and he said, whoever gets the quarter gets the job. And he would toss it into this crowd of men, and they would fight over that quarter, right? People would sweat, they would fall out, they would work ridiculous number of hours, and it was because of labor unions that we, whether we're unionized or not,
Yeah.
enjoy the life that we're living, right? And my dad, who was up from West Point, Mississippi, you know, he worked in a plant. He worked for Henry Ford as a crane operator. And that allowed Detroit to become a place where you could come from absolutely, you know, rural background, little or no education, and you could become a middle class person.
Yeah.
You could own a house. You could send your kids to school for free. And those things didn't happen by accident. So when you find sort of, again, young people who just kind of like fluff off the idea of a union, why is that important, and get out of my way. I'm having my latte right now. You really want to be able to talk a little bit about how important labor unions were and still are to our culture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And we have a lot of great labor collections here as well. So, yeah, so we love to promote that also. So you're like,
I got to come back here just and spend a week just wandering around as opposed to doing a concert. But
yeah,
yeah.
Absolutely. And we welcome you to do that anytime you want.
Thank you.
Absolutely. But another aspect of your life and of your musical life is your family. You brought some members of your family along who are going to perform with you. I know you frequently collaborate with your wife. So
Yeah.
explain, just talk about your family a little and how they've supported you in this. And
that is, I can't even describe how amazing it is to have children who were like little, little bundles, and now they can sing, and now they perform. My son got a scholarship to Alabama A&M for choral music. But in Detroit, there are two schools, the School of Performing Arts, DSA, and especially there's a place called Renaissance High School. Mm-hmm. My son went to Renaissance, my daughter went to DSA. And they had sung with everybody in Detroit. Like, not only did they do concert spirituals, not only did they learn German and Italian pieces, and my wife and I just kind of sitting there going, but they also, were raised in the church, and every Sunday they're being exposed to gospel and hard gospel and urban gospel and all of that good stuff. And then they joined a group called the Hallelujah Singers, which were really flamboyant, kind of director by the name of Eloquent Weaver. And that's where my son met my daughter-in-law, Rosa. She had the same experience, but she grew up in Columbus, Ohio. And so now there's this core group of the Jones trio, my daughter, my son, and my daughter-in-law, and they sing. And of course, my wife is just the powerhouse. So I thought, wouldn't it be great if they joined me for at least one song? And now I got these little grandkids, and they're amazing. Mm-hmm. My oldest granddaughter reads way beyond her level of a 7-year-old, and my youngest granddaughter is kind of like this little diva. Mm-hmm. She went to Disney World and came back wearing a little pleather jacket, these little Mickey Mouse glasses, and she's like, "Yo, Papi, what's going on?" I'm like, when did you become a little Puerto Rican princess? It's wonderful. But she can draw like crazy. So I love to draw, right? we sit down and draw together. So it's like, it's such a blessing to see some of the things that I love in my kids and then in my grandkids.
Yeah. Well, we look forward to hearing them tonight in the concert, and I should say we also forgive them for supplanting the banjo and kicking it out of the car, right? So
Yeah, if somebody here's got one, I mean, I could deal with that.
Right, right.
But no,
Yeah.
I'm good.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I know that my friend Matt Watrobo would kick my butt if I didn't ask you about common chords as well.
Yes, sir. Well, your friend, my friend, Matt and I have been friends for over 35 years. And somebody in a fairly affluent, not fairly, a really affluent community near Detroit called Grosse Pointe invited us to play in a record store, which used to be a thing. And I came from like acoustic blues. He came from folk. And we didn't know, like, what are we going to do, right? So we got together and we discovered we had a common love of country music. I was a weird kid, grew up watching Hee Haw. And so that night, we played a lot of country. And we started to realize, like, we have these chords in common. And it took us 20, 25 years before we decided to form a nonprofit called Common Chords. And it's about breaking down the barriers, racial, social, age, ethnic, that separate us, right? And we got this nonprofit going, and part of the idea is to go into communities, diverse communities, and get them to understand you don't have to be alike in order to appreciate one another. Matt and I are very different individuals. I'm a Baptist pastor. More often than not, on a Sunday, I'm in church. Matt is an avid baseball fan, so more often than not, he's at Comerica Park.
Right.
I don't think I've been to a baseball game in 10 years.
Yeah.
So that part of what we have is different, but what we have in common are values. And so I have learned a lot from Matt. I think Matt's learned a lot from me. And now we also have, in the church where I pastor, we have this building that we have been blessed to refurbish. And this summer, our plan is to start doing a folk school, to have some local area musicians. There's one young man by the name of Aaron Jonah Lewis, who's a great fiddler, banjo player, guitar player, etc. He's collected a core of younger musicians. And our plan is to like teach kids these 3 chords on their instrument of choice and turn them loose. Because kids are always writing. They think they're writing rap, but they're writing verse, right? And whatever you put that verse to becomes a given style of music.
Yeah.
And it can, if you get 1 or 2, who may become performers or professionals, that's fine. But everybody discovers how much it enhances your life to be able to write verse and to make music.
Yeah.
And to use it as a form that allows us to communicate with one another.
Absolutely, and as you will show in the concert, I'm sure, if you take that 1-4-5 chord progression and that pentatonic scale and
It's
you add the verse,
amazing what you can do
it's
with
rap,
it.
but it's also blues, or it is
Absolutely.
wherever you want to take it.
Absolutely.
So thank you so much. I usually like to end these interviews by asking whether there's anything that I didn't get to that you would like to say to our audience here at the Library of Congress.
Man, this was a great interview. I really enjoyed talking to you, Stephen, and always do.
Me too.
One of the things that I'm working on right now is at a certain point you feel like, man, I should like write a book. Everybody's like, you should write a book. You should write a book. I've been trying to write a book for 4 years, and it becomes one essay or one experience or one story, and they never connect. For some reason this year, I went to a Bible verse, and it was 7 verses, and it talks about the idea, Old Testament story, of Elisha, the prophet, and there's a widow who has nothing, and she has only a pot of oil. And as she pours the oil into various vessels, the oil continues to flow until she runs out of vessels. For some reason, that story clicked with me, coming out of COVID or whatever reason. And I started writing it. It's just started to flow out. So I'm looking forward to perhaps having that book come out this year. But the metaphor works for music. As long as you keep pouring into different vessels, education or activism or union or inspiration, as long as you keep pouring into these vessels, the oil never runs out. But the minute that you say, I'm done, the oil stops.
Yeah.
So this is one of those things. This is another great experience for me to come to the Library of Congress to pour into this vessel and to find out how many other great vessels there are already here waiting to be discovered. So I'm just really excited to be here this year.
All right, we're excited to have you. So the Reverend Robert B. Jones, Sr., we
Yes,
are
sir.
so happy to have you. Thank you for doing this interview and for your wonderful concert tonight.
Thank you, Stephen.